Now going to begin project 2, collage candles. So at this point, you have ideally completed exercise 2, which also involves a lot of collage work. So this might feel a little bit repetitive, but the important thing is, just like project 1, we are repeating a lot of steps to really familiarize ourselves with these new tools and get really comfortable using them, especially with things like the pen tool that takes a lot of practice. That was particularly one for me that I can remember in college. Took me a really, really long time to get the hang of it. And I still don't even know if I've quite mastered it. I hope I've mastered it enough to get by in my career, but there's always more work that could be done. So we're going to continue to build upon the knowledge that we've already started with our previous exercises and previous project and begin this collage candle piece. And this is our first sort of foray into packaging design. We're not necessarily going to print these out. You, of course, can if you wish. But we're starting to understand, what creating a label could actually look like. So this would be a packaging design for a candle. So we're creating a label that would be wrapped around a candle. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of think about our overall shape a little bit, overall die line, even though we don't necessarily need a die line for this project. And another really important thing that I want to mention with this project is that we are going to come back to this project later in the semester. So we're going to be bringing this project into our midterm project. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you're practicing good file organization, because this is one particular case where you're going to need to access these files later. So don't lose them, and make sure that they're organized so that you can always find them. So you can see I've already created a new file here, and I've done that just by looking at the instructions that we have here in Canvas. So for this project, you'll create a new file that is 2.8 inches tall by 5 inches wide at 300 ppi. Just to go over that again quickly, File New or Command N on your keyboard. You can see because I've already done this, it's saving this in the presets. So I'll create a file that's 5 inches wide. Make sure you select inches by 2.8 inches tall. 300 pixels per inch. Make sure to do that here because we know that that is difficult to adjust later, especially as you work further along in this project. And ideally have a transparent background. You can always change this later, but transparent background is what we want if you're just starting out. And then you'll hit create. I'm just going to close this because I already created that new file. And if I go into my Finder window, I've already selected or saved a bunch of images that I've downloaded from Unsplash. And this might be a good way to kind of start out your project, is just look at Unsplash or look at images on your phone. Start to think about kind of a general feeling, a general vibe, a potential scent for this candle. So you can see from the images that I've been grabbing, I'm going for sort of a feeling. I'm not going for a particular like orange scented candle, but I want something that sort of feels like it's citrus meets ocean. So very fresh and energetic, maybe a little salty. I don't know. So you can start sort of noting down some ideas for this. This isn't a super concept heavy project, but once you get to your final project turn in, I would like you to have something where the idea in your head or these notes that you've jotted down are visually represented by your imagery. So if you want a fresh scent, I want to see that represented by images that feel and look fresh. If you want more of a musky scented candle or something that's a little more abstract, I would love to kind of see that displayed in those images, or at least have a way of explaining that when you turn this in. So just sort of start to think about different scents and feelings and imagery and how they can all contribute to this piece, to this candle label. So I'm going to start dragging some images into my candle label or my candle collage. I'm going to start, I think, with this kind of beach image. And you can just click and drag images into Photoshop like I just did. You can also go to File, Place Embedded. You should be pretty familiar with that by now. And feel free, once you bring these images in, play around with the scale and even the rotation. I'm just going to rotate it a little bit, and I'm going to make this a little bit larger because I like this sort of ripple effect that's going to fill the width of my candle label. And then I'm going to hit enter to place it. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this layer just for good layer hygiene practice. I'm going to call this background beach or something like that. And then I'm going to start, I'm just going to move it up a little bit, start making a selection using the pen tool. And starting right at the edge, and I'm just zooming in using the trackpad on my computer, starting right at the edge. And for this selection, I'm going to play around with making some curved lines in my selection. And you can create curves by just clicking and dragging, and you'll see as you do that that these little toggles come out at the ends of the anchor point. So this little square that's blue that I'm hovering over is called the anchor point. And then I don't actually know what these are particularly called, but we're just sort of calling them the curve toggles. So they're not anchor points, but they're ways that you can manipulate the curve of your selection. And you can go back in and edit this later. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. I'm not going to be super precise with this, but I do hope that you are going to be more precise than I am. And then if you do want to kind of stop your anchor point here and end it at a straight angle, you can do that as well just by clicking that. Oh, actually, sorry. You have to hold Option on your keyboard and then click. And you can see that then it removes that curved toggle. And then when you add another point there, you can see that this side of the anchor point is straight, whereas before it was curved. So I'd love for all of you to just sort of practice this and get the hang of it. This is sort of a difficult tool to explain, and it's one that requires a lot of precision and sort of hand-eye coordination. But the great thing about this is you can always go in and edit this later. And I'm just selecting a little bit around the artboard. That doesn't matter too much. I just want to make sure that these edges of the image are straight, and then this part on the top is where I have that more custom shape. So I'm just making sure that I'm selecting all the way around because I'm going to be creating a layer mask with this. So with the pen tool still open, and once you've closed what's called a path, it's going to look something like this. And the nice thing about paths in Photoshop is that they're saved. And if you look where I'm hovering right now in the layers panel, you can click this little paths tab and you can rename, you can even group, or maybe, no, you can't group, but you can rename and sort of organize your paths just like you would layers. So the nice thing with the pen tool is that all of your paths are automatically saved once you've completed them, as I just did here. So I completed that shape similar to how you have to complete the selection with the polygonal lasso tool. And I can zoom in, and with the pen tool still selected, I can go and hover over this path, and you can see, I'm going back and forth right now. You can see as I hover, the pen will show this little plus icon. And that's one way that you can add more anchor points to your path. So if I zoom in here, say I want to get really precise and come in at a little divot right here to select this area, I can add an anchor point there. I'll probably need about 2 or 3 to do this. I can add another anchor point here. I'm zooming in really far, add another anchor point here. And then in order to move these anchor points around, because the important thing to remember is with the pen tool, with your path selected, you can only use the pen tool once you've completed that path. You can only use it in editing that path to add or remove anchor points. But if you want to move those existing anchor points or ones you've just added around, you're going to use something called the direct selection tool. And you can see now I'm hovering over that. It's just a couple below the pen tool. And you can see this is how you adjust or move anchor points around on a path. So I'm going to select that. And you can tell that an anchor point is selected. When you click on it, it changes to blue, as you see I'm doing here. So I want to select this little anchor point that's in the middle of those other two. And I'm just going to click and move it a little bit lower. And then I can also adjust the other two so that it really hugs around that little divot shape that I'm trying to select. So all of your selections are going to look a little bit different based on what you're, trying to achieve in your piece. So I'm just going to hit P on my keyboard. That's for the pen tool. That's your keyboard shortcut for this. I'm going to play around with adding another anchor point right here. And then once again, I'm selecting that direct selection tool. That is A on the keyboard. So I just hit A on my keyboard, and now I'm going to click and move this anchor point. And I'm going to adjust the curve of this a little bit. Maybe I'll add another anchor point right here. I just hit A again to move it. P again. Now I'm moving that anchor point. So you can see, you can get pretty precise with this. I'm not going to get super precise here just for the sake of time. But I would love to see all of you practice this. This is an important one if you're continuing with your design career or design classes at Yavapai College, especially when you get into working with Illustrator. The pen tool is a very important tool to use in Illustrator, and it will be almost exactly the same as it appears here. I think there's only some slight differences. So a really important one to master, if you're going to get into things like vector illustration, or just furthering your design knowledge in any way. Okay, so now I have this somewhat rough selection. Hopefully yours is going to look a lot nicer than mine. And what we can do from here is turn this, what's called a path, into an actual selection, which is what we need to create things like masks. So with that path selection or selected in my layers panel, and it looks like it's selected in the same way that layers are, where it's sort of highlighted in that gray color. And I just double clicked on it. I'm going to rename it. I'm just going to call it background bottom or something, but this is up to you. And if I go to the bottom of this panel and hover over this little dashed line circle, you can see it says load path as a selection. I'm just going to click that. And now it's turned that path into a selection that I can create a mask with. Another way that you can do this is you can right click on the path and hit make selection. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the layers panel to make sure that I'm applying my mask to the right layer. And I'm just going to hover over layer mask, which you should be really familiar with, and just click that. And now you can see it's created a mask for me with that exact custom shape that I wanted. Okay, and now I can sort of decide what I want to do from here. I think I'm going to add a couple more images in. So I'm going to play around with adding this citrus image. I'm going to make this a lot larger and rotate it. And I think what I want to do is sort of put it in between this color of the sand and this part of the ocean here in this like funky shape here. So I'm just gonna make it pretty large. I don't know, maybe something like that. Hit enter to place it. I'm gonna rename this file oranges, or sorry, the layer or citrus or something like that. And now what I'm going to do is just decrease the opacity of this layer a lot. I'm not sure if we've gone over this yet, but you can always play around with opacity of layers by just doing what I just did. You can hit that opacity arrow and just toggle this or type in a number. And you can always adjust this later. It's not a permanent change. So I'm going to decrease it quite a bit so that I can see the oranges, but I can see this kind of funky shape behind because that's what I want to make a selection with. So once again, I hit P for the pen tool on my keyboard, and I'm just going around and making a pretty rough selection. I should probably spend a little more time, but this is good enough for now. So I'm just sort of selecting this shape, which I can sort of just loosely see because I decreased the opacity of my citrus image. And I can just turn off the citrus image just to make sure that I've selected that area. So that's all I wanted to select, was this sort of darker pink area in here. And from there, got my path. Just going to hit that little button. Also, when you initially create the selection, it might not always appear after you've edited it, but you have, with your pen tool, you have this options panel at the top, and it will say, you're creating a path, and it asks you what you want to do with it. So you can turn it into a selection, you can mask or create a shape with it. Let's actually see if it will just automatically create a mask for me. No, that's not doing what I want. Sorry, I don't normally use that. So we want to make sure we hit selection in this case, and we're going to hit OK. And now we can, with that layer that we want to mask selected, I'm going to turn up the opacity so I can see it again. And now I'm hitting that layer mask button now that I've created the selection. And now you can see it's masked the oranges within that area that I wanted. And if you're seeing your path still selected here and you don't want that, you want to maybe just start moving some images around, or you want to make sure you're deselecting that, you can go back to that paths panel and just click outside of it. So now we've got the citruses masked. Now I think I'm going to add a texture here. I'm going to add like a sand texture. So I'm going to grab this image. Alternatively, I'll just show you, you can also go to File, Place Embedded. And you just need to make sure that you know exactly where you are saving your images. So I'm going to place this image. Going to make it a lot larger to kind of fill this area at the right. Hit Enter to place it. And now I'm just going to turn it off for a moment. And in case we haven't gone over that in the videos, you can always turn layers on and off by hovering over this little eyeball icon to the left of the layers. So I'm just going to turn that off for a moment. And now I'm going to make another path. And because I accidentally merged these two paths earlier, I just want to make sure. Yeah, I did something wrong, but once you deselect the path that you've already made and then you use the the pen tool again, you can see that now it's created a new path for me. So that's what I meant to do previously, but I accidentally merged those two. So just be mindful of that. Take a look at your paths panel in the layers icon and just make sure that you're creating new paths unless you want to merge them onto single paths. So once again, I'm making a fairly loose selection here. Now I've completed the path. Up at the top, I hit selection. And now it makes that little dashed line, the marching ants. Now I'm going to turn this sand image on again and use that selection to make a mask. So this is sort of the general composition that I'm going with. I might go ahead and start adding some adjustment layers and playing around with the blending modes, which you should all be familiar with now from exercise 1. But let's just add a few things here. So I'm gonna start with a hue saturation, and I just did that by clicking this little icon that sort of looks like a black and white cookie. And it's just to the right of the layer mask icon, and if you hover over that, it should say, create new fill or adjustment layer. So I just clicked hue saturation. And now this hue saturation properties menu opens up above it. And I'm going to play around with increasing the saturation quite a bit and kind of adjusting the hue so that it appears, I don't know, a little bit like that, a little bit more like pink and teal. Maybe I'll leave lightness at 0. You can always reset these by just typing 0 and that resets it to the original, or of course you can turn that hue saturation layer on and off. So say you only wanted to apply this hue saturation to one layer. What you need to be mindful of is anytime you create an adjustment layer like I just did, it's applying that adjustment to every single layer that's below it. So you can see I have hue saturation at the top. I have 3 layers below it. I'm just going to rename this one like sand texture or something so I know what that is. So you can see when I turn it on and off, it's adjusting the color and saturation on all 3 of these images. Maybe I only want to apply that to the citrus image. I can click and drag it so that it's just above citrus, but it's still going to apply that adjustment to the background layer, which is shown here where my cursor is. If I want to apply that to only citrus, I can hover over the bottom of the hue saturation layer and hold Option on my keyboard, and you can see that this little icon appears with an arrow. And then if I click there, it now adds this little arrow to the layer like you see here. And that means that now it's only applying the hue saturation to that particular layer. So you can see as I'm toggling that on and off, I'm turning the citruses really pink and magenta and bright orange, and now it's off. And something to be mindful of is now if I'm moving these layers around, so you can see if I click here, it's automatically selecting the citrus layer. But if I, say I move this around and I bring this up to the top, now it's sort of delinking what I just did with that hue saturation layer. So just be mindful of this, that if you use this tool and you do that Option click to apply an adjustment to the layer below it, you need to keep that same layer order or sort of group it or link it to make sure that those layers stay together. Actually, that's not a way to do it. So you just actually need to keep these layers in the same order. Sorry about that. And I'm just going to Command Z a couple times to take this back to the place that I want to keep it. So just be really mindful of that once you do that and then you start reordering things, it's going to affect those adjustments. So probably the best way to do it is just to select those 2 layers, so that citrus layer and then the adjustment that I made to it, and I've selected both of them and now I'm going to group them together. Oops, citrus. And now I can click and drag that and adjust the order if I need to without affecting that hue saturation that I've applied to it. And if you need to undo this, if you don't want that hue saturation applied anymore, you can just do the same thing that we just did. You can hover over the bottom of that hue saturation adjustment layer, hold Option on your keyboard, and you can see it has this arrow with a remove. You can click that and now it removes it. But I want to keep it there. Another kind of interesting thing that you can do is, let's see, I'm going to make a copy. Make a copy of this citrus layer, and you can see that now I've affected that layer order. So I'm going to do that Option click again to make sure that that stays together. But I've duplicated the citrus layer and I've placed it at the top, and I'm going to delete the layer mask because I want to grab just this citrus this citrus in the center of it here. So I just used object selection and I've masked it just so I have a big solid citrus slice here. So say I want this in the corner, but I want this citrus to be within this sand shape, sand texture that I have behind it. You can also do the option click to sort of apply a layer to an existing layer. So you can see when I do that, it's now applying that citrus layer to the layer below it. And the tricky thing is, of course, to be mindful of layer order, because once you move that order around, it's going to remove what I just did. So just keep that in mind. And then you can move it, within that area because it's applied to the sand texture below it. It's using the mask of that sand texture. So even though the citrus has a mask in itself, it's now sort of applying this sand mask on top of that. Hopefully that makes sense. But just sort of start to play around with that and get a feel for it in your file. And now what we're going to do is add some text here. I'm just going to hit T on my keyboard, click here. I'm just going to type the word fresh, kind of put it down here. I want to make it pretty big, so I'm going to adjust the size where I just highlighted at the top. Let's see what 300 pixels gets us, maybe even 350. So feel free to kind of play around with scale in this too. I want my text to be really bright and bold. I'm also going to hold Option on my keyboard and click and drag this text to the right, and that's just duplicating it. So you can see in my layers panel, it now says fresh copy. I'm going to rename this to fresh back. I'm going to move it behind what we're going to call fresh top. And I just highlighted that text, and I'm going to change the color of it, turn the text on top back on, and now I can sort of adjust this a little bit just to kind of get me a cool effect. And then another thing that I can play around with is using that option click to apply layers to other layers. I'm going to use, I think I'll just use this image. Yeah, I'll use this image here. I'm going to click and drag that into my file, make it pretty large, rotate it, because I'm going to take this blue ocean texture and apply it to the text that's in the background. So I'm hovering over the bottom of this. I'm actually going to rename this layer first to ocean texture blue, or just something that I can sort of remember what that means. And then I'm hitting Option on the keyboard, clicking, and now you can see that it's applying that layer, that image, to just that text layer. So it kind of gives me an interesting effect. I might even adjust the blending mode of that layer. I'm going to change it to multiply so that it's a little bit more subtle, so that I can still read the white text. So feel free to really play here. Bring in a lot of different images, as many as you wish. Play around with textures. Think about interesting ways to cut things out. With the oranges, I didn't necessarily cut out orange shapes here. I used the shapes in the images below the oranges to kind of create an interesting mask shape here. But then I did use the sort of circular shape of the orange in the front. So, the possibilities are really endless here. And you can see in some of the examples that I put on Canvas, some of our previous students used the entire artboard and filled it, but I welcome you to think about, if this were a real label with a die line, could it be something that's sort of jagged and almost in the middle of the artboard, like my example is here? So that's really up to you, and you can kind of play around with the cutout on one side, or all four sides could be, a sort of jagged or interesting die line or cutout. And just like a cooking show, I have a slightly more complete version that I worked on a little bit longer that you can see on my screen now. You can see there's a lot of adjustments done here to sort of marry the color of these images. So there's a lot of pink and sort of blood orange color in the background, And you can see I've worked on my layer hygiene a little bit in the layers panel. So I've got my background layer. I've also created this color fill layer. So there's blending modes within the layers that are on top of a solid color. And that's something that I did just by using the pen tool and then filling it with a solid color. Or I think I actually did an effect here. It was probably an adjustment and then solid color, which you can apply to a path or a selection that you've just made. So you can play around with solid color shapes, graphics here as well. And then you can see that my images in the background here, this one has an overlay blending mode. This one has linear burn. These all do different things, and you can kind of just, you can see I'm selecting different ones now. Feel free to play around with these and see what different types of effects that you get. You're only going to really understand these tools by playing around with them. So you can see all of these have different blending modes. And then I added a saturation layer to increase the saturation above all of those, as well as color. And then because I have this bright pink fill layer below everything with blending modes for each layer on top, I'm getting this very pink effect here. And then I even played around with adding the citrus as a cutout right here. So lots of things to think about. I know these are a lot of new tools, or maybe not a lot of new tools, but a lot of new possibilities, like blending modes, just a lot of things to experiment with and play around with. I'd love to see a lot of experimentation here. And when you turn things in, definitely explain your process a little bit. Tell us about how you experimented, what your ideation process looked like. How did you think about what images you were going to choose, or what that sort of vibe or feeling was for your particular piece. So just start to think about all of those things, and feel free to add that in the description when you turn in. And I can't wait to see your work. And as always, please reach out with any questions that you might have. Thanks, guys.